Welcome back. In episode 1, we talked about what reasons are. In episode 2, we applied that to moral reasons. I recommend watching those videos first, otherwise today might not make sense. Because in this episode, it's time to get all emotional. Part 1. Rational emotions. There's a long-standing idea that reasons and emotion are opposites. We'll be looking at some examples shortly of people who thought that throughout history, but first, why are they supposedly opposed? Well, one way of cashing this out is to say that emotions can get us caught up in ourselves and stop us from observing the world. The ancient Stoic philosophers had a conception of emotions as passions, things that happen to you. The Greek word is parthe, that which befalls you, from whence we get words like pathos, pathetic, and indeed apathetic, meaning in English to not care. The Stoics viewed passions as a form of suffering, and indeed they thought that being apathetic was a good thing. But the philosopher Alison Jaggar points out that to have an emotional response to something is just that, to have a response. Emotions don't just come out of nowhere, they are a reaction. They are about something, just as reasons are always about something. We talked about that in episode 1. And if I'm having an emotional reaction to the world, I must first have observed the world. But that doesn't mean that emotion plays no important role in observation. Jaggar points out that science is guided by values and by emotion. Not just individual experiments, but how we decide what to investigate scientifically in the first place. Where would science be without curiosity and joy? Science as an institution rather than a method is also highly reflective of the values of the society that is practicing it, and emotions and values are very closely linked, as we are about to learn. So maybe a more nuanced way of cashing out this supposed distinction is that, okay, emotions aren't opposed to observation, but they cloud us, they prevent us from exercising our judgment, and for that reason they are irrational. But the philosopher Sarah Ahmed points out that emotions involve judgments and appraisals. This is something that the Stoics understood as well. I don't get angry for no reason, literally in the absence of a reason. I get angry at least in part because I judge the situation to be negative and worth getting angry about. Now I might be wrong, it might not be worth getting angry about, but in order to find that out, we would have to engage with my reasons for judging the situation negatively as I do. Just because I'm having an emotional response doesn't mean I'm being irrational, not tuning into reasons. Because emotions involve judgments, they are closely linked to values. For instance, if I have strong moral values, I might have a very strong emotional response to an injustice that somebody with different values might be less fussed about maybe. And because emotions are linked to values, to say that somebody's response is emotional and therefore irrational is to imply that certain values should not be held. This is where the feminist concept of tone policing comes in. Think about how certain politicians value being civil to their colleagues, even when those colleagues vote to condemn tens of thousands of people to their deaths. That reflects a desire that only certain values be held, or at least advanced publicly. That somebody who holds strong values that might prompt them to anger and disrespect over that situation not come into the equation. Bearing that in mind, let's take a look at what various people throughout history have said about emotion and reason, and who has which one. Part 2, a short piece of historical verbatim theatre. Here, the very constitution of the soul has shown us the way. In it, one part rules, the other is ruled, the one being the virtue of the rational part, and the other of the irrational part. Now it is obvious that these same principles apply generally, and therefore almost all things rule, and are ruled according to their nature. But the kind of rule differs. The free man rules over the slave, after another manner from that in which the male rules over the female, or the man over the child. Although the parts of the soul are present in all of them, they are present in different degrees, for the slave has no deliberative faculty at all. The female has it, but it is without authority. The child has it, but it is into several things. if precisely the wisest man were at the top of society, and the next wisest next, and so on until we reached the Demerara from whom downwards through the horse and so on, there is no question, hitherto, then were this a perfect world. I say, if the black gentleman is born to be a servant, and indeed is useful in God's creation only as a servant, then let him hire not by the month, but by a very much longer term, that he is hired for life, and enfranchised ever so small a number of females, they could not possibly keep it closed, and that ultimately means adult suffrage. The government of this country would therefore be handed over to a majority who would not be men, but women. Women are creatures of impulse and emotion. They do not decide things on the grounds of reason, as men do. I have sometimes of accuracy, which easily degenerates into untruthfulness, is in fact the main characteristic of the mind. The European is a close reasoner. His statements of fact are devoid of any ambiguity. He is a natural logician, albeit he may not have studied logic. He is by nature skeptical and requires proof before he can accept the truth of any proposition. His trained intelligence works like the piece of a mechanism. The mind of the on the other hand, like his picturesque streets, is eminently wanting in symmetry. His reasoning is of the most slipshod description. Although the ancient Arabs acquired in a somewhat higher degree the science of dialectics, their descendants are eminently lacking in the logical faculty. They are often incapable of drawing the most obvious conclusions from any simple premises of which they may admit the truth. Endeavour to elicit a plain statement of facts from any ordinary Egyptian. His explanation will generally be lengthy and wanting in lucidity. He will probably contradict himself half a dozen times before he finishes his story. He will often break down under the mildest process. The more the concept of reason becomes emasculated, the more easily it lends itself to ideological manipulation and to the propagation of even the most blatant which escaped the early impact of Newtonian thinking have retained the essentially pre-Newtonian view that the real world is almost completely internal to the observer. Empirical reality has a much different significance for many of the new countries than it does for the West, because in a certain sense they never went through the process of discovery. For the Arabs, this situation is not governed by this kind of logic, for objectivity is not of value in the Arab system. Women, on average, have more openness directed towards feelings and aesthetics than men. Being emotionally disengaged helps us better reason about the facts. Part 3. Knowing without asking. Those are just a few examples out of the many I could have chosen. For at least 2,000 years, people with power and privilege have tended to claim greater rationality than those without. Jagar writes, "Not only has reason been contrasted with the emotional, but it has also been associated with the mental, the cultural, the universal, the public, and the male, whereas emotion has been associated with the irrational, the physical, the natural, the particular, the private, and of course, the female. Reason has been associated with members of dominant political, social, and cultural groups, and emotion with members of subordinate groups." We heard Aristotle and Thomas Carlyle claiming to be more rational than slaves. We heard MPs and politicians claiming to be more rational than women who wanted the vote and colonial subjects who wanted to run their own countries. We heard American foreign policy advisors claiming to be more objective and rational than just about everybody. And we heard a former Google software engineer saying that women are more emotional than men, and that in part explains why there are fewer women in tech jobs. Something to bear in mind is that all those people who claimed greater rationality were not themselves devoid of emotion. Of course they had emotions. It's just that part of claiming to be rational with a capital R is having the approved emotions towards the approved people. And since emotions are linked to values, that means having the approved values too. You can see now how those examples dismissed certain points of view as emotional, making some ideas, values, and perspectives unwelcome. For instance, the idea that women should be allowed to vote, or Egyptians should be allowed to run Egypt, or slaves should be free. What's very telling is that rationality versus emotion discourse does not engage with the other point of view, and at the same time tries to justify why it doesn't need to engage, because the opposition is being irrational. It's a form of what communications professor James Cherney calls anti-rhetoric, a form of speech that claims to be the only rational, only objective, only method of seeking truth, whilst ignoring the fact that it is just one perspective amongst many. For instance, we heard from Lord Cromer, who was the British dictator of Egypt that we appointed when we invaded, and he was the guy saying that Egyptians can't reason properly and they keep changing whatever they say. Generously setting aside Cromer's racist generalizations, it doesn't seem to have occurred to him that if Egyptian people are a little bit shifty when talking to him, that might be because he talks to them as the unelected representative of an occupying military force that holds the power of life and death over them. So understandably, they might be a little bit nervous. He thinks he's looking at the situation objectively, when in fact, he's changing the situation by observing it from a position of power. Similarly, it doesn't seem to have occurred to William Kramer MP that if women appear to be emotional when demanding the vote, that might be because it's very important to them. Nor did it occur to Thomas Carlyle to ask black people what they thought about emancipation when he was writing about what he thought was good for them. Nor indeed did it occur to James Damore when writing his manifesto about what women prefer in jobs to actually ask and cite a single woman on what her preferences were. Because we're just more rational. We already know we're right, we don't need to ask anybody else, and anybody who doesn't share our values is being emotional and therefore irrational and can be dismissed, and the violence and oppression inflicted on them can continue. As well as the violences of enslavement and oppression, what was also happening in the cases we looked at was large-scale epistemic injustice. A wrong done to a group of people specifically in their capacity as havers and imparters of knowledge. Particularly in the cases of women and slaves, people were being denied access to the pool of human knowledge and then blamed for it, called irrational when nobody had really given them a chance to show what they might be able to do, given full access to the tools of rationality and education and learning on their own terms. It was never a triumph of reason over the irrational and emotional, but an artificial victory of social cheating. In this episode, we've identified a problem, which is that rationality, or at least the appearance of it, can be used to close ourselves off from other points of view, like we already know best. And it would be nice if we could talk about how to salvage it, and maybe discuss ways in which reason can open us up to new perspectives. And at the end of episode 2, we identified that being open-minded to new perspectives might be the key to being moral as well. So, the fourth and final episode in this series will ask, are you open-minded? If you like today's lesson, I have a tip jar at paypal.me/philosophytube. Think of it like me putting a hat round at the end of the lecture. Or patreon.com/philosophytube is where you could make a monthly donation to help me keep making videos like this one. And don't forget to subscribe.